I don't see anybody in here yet, but yeah, good evening to everybody. I hope everybody is doing well tonight. Well, tonight I've got quite a lineup here of things I want to discuss. I'm just gonna wait for people to come in here. So yeah, I don't see anybody yet, but yep, got quite a bit of topics to cover. Everything from my upcoming projects to the goings on and how that's going to affect the upcoming situation that we're all going to face. Oh, I see my first person has arrived. Who do we have here? See if I can see the chat for a second. Somebody say something. Anything. Oh, they left. Well, can't make everybody happy. So, anyways, I don't see anybody in here, but you know what? I'm going to go ahead and start talking about what I plan to cover tonight. I have quite a lineup of information, and I'm going to be discussing everything from the Sino-Russian invasion. Oh, hi there, Michelle. Great to see you. Great to see you. I'm going to be discussing everything from the... I got 6 people now. Great. I'm going to be discussing everything from the upcoming Sino-Russian invasion and my predictions that I'm going to elaborate on more, that I've said before, but I'm going to reiterate them. I'm also going to discuss my upcoming projects. I'm sure you all seen in my community tab. Oh, hey, Okie girl, great to see you. I'm sure, yeah, I'm going to be discussing my internal Syrian-style conflict. Hey, serving Yeshua, King of Kings, welcome. I'm going to be discussing... Hey, Kathy. I'm going to be discussing the internal Syrian-style conflict. Hey, Juan. Yeah, I'm going to be discussing that because I've been diligently putting that together because I promised everybody that one of these days I'm going to do a live program that'll, be uninterrupted, unlike my past work where I did the 96-hour invasion. Hey, Irish, welcome. Yeah, where I did the 96-hour invasion documentary playlist in my playlists. That was basically a series of videos of different battles. But in this one, I'm going to do it as a live for the internal Second American civil conflict, the Syrian-style civil conflict. And if you all visited my community tab, then you saw that post where I posted the map, and I listed in that post, if you click the read more part, I listed the color coding and which factions they were and what they represented. Basically, when you would have the collapse arrive finally, you would have this globalist regime in power that we currently have. Everything's going to backfire on them because all the false flags they're conducting, like all these mass, events, it's all going to backfire on them, along with the shortages. The food and fuel collapse, which I predicted would get really bad this summer. You're going to have all that occurring, and you're going to have basically everything go downhill really fast. Now, in my internal Syrian-style conflict map, I basically made it along these lines, that the civil conflict began with severe food and fuel shortages, causing famine among some people. Overreach of the globalist regime in power contributed as well, like all the false flags. Riots ensued nationwide in response to these combined pressures. It was like a pressure cooker on this country. The globalist regime responded with brute force to those to certain riots occurring in areas which they held firm control over, such as a few of the large cities. In response, a group of generals would launch a coup to return the USA back to constitutional rule. But the coup failed, and parts of the military split from the regime, creating the Free American Army, which is basically, hey Watchman, which is basically a sort of a parallel to the Free Syrian Army in Syria, how they split from Bashar al-Assad's regime, because that was part of his former military. When discipline broke down, they broke off from the regime. Now, you would have the same thing happening here, where you would have parts of the National Guard and certain reserve units splitting from the regime. Now, you would have the active duty armed forces, which are also spread around the world. They would stay loyal to the regime along with all the paramilitary alphabet soup agencies, but that would not be a large enough force to hold down a nation of this vast size. If you saw the map, you saw that the regime and the areas loyal to the regime, pro-regime areas and regime-controlled or regime, which are like their forces, only really extended control over the West Coast and half of Washington State and half of Oregon, and also parts of the Northeast, and certain islands, like certain big cities like Chicago and Detroit, and also certain installations where the forces remained in, loyal to the regime and control of those areas, and also, like the Hoover Dam area where they were trying to reroute power to California because it's a regime loyalist area. So yeah, it would be a very interesting thing. You would see various factions arising amid all the chaos in the country. Now, I'm going to go down the line and I'm going to explain all this. Now, on the map, the small areas controlled by the regime were pro-regime or regime-controlled areas. Now, you also had the La Raza narco state, which was the sky blue color, which is basically a bunch of former gangsters, like prison gangs and drug cartels from Mexico coming up in there and trying to set up their own free narco state because the Mexican government was putting pressure on them, so they fled and took advantage of the Civil War conditions and went into New Mexico to establish a narco state where they would set up certain laboratories, I'll just call them, to be able to continue their work of producing narcotics and selling them and having a huge war chest as a result. Now, if you know anything about those groups, they're also very resourceful, and they've made vehicles, armored vehicles, out of civilian vehicles. So you would have elements like that in control of certain areas. You'd also have states like Texas and Florida outright seceding from the country to establish their own free republics. Now, keep in mind, Texas has its own power grid. It also has access to lots of the, oh yes, I am happy tonight, Okie girl. I'm pretty happy. I'm glad that I've gotten this finally starting to work on it, my project here that I'm explaining. You would have states like Texas and Florida outright seceding and starting their own free nations. Now, Texas, with its own power grid, its own oil and oil refineries, would be able to do this a lot easier than most other areas. Now, Florida would be aligned with Texas as an alliance, and you would see a lot of sea trade between the two, where Texas would try to do what it could to keep Florida afloat by sending it oil from Houston and other ports, Houston and Beaumont and Corpus Christi and such. You would see Florida trying to expel regime forces along the coast, like especially in the Jacksonville area where there's a lot of regime strongholds, like their installations, and also like near Daytona Beach and other areas where they, along that eastern seaboard coast where they had other installations up and down. So you would see that going on. The National Guards of Florida and of Texas would become the national militaries of Texas and Florida. Now, in other areas, you would see other factions like, hey, Jennifer, hey, lovey. You would see other factions like the Mormon state, which is like basically a parallel to the Islamic State in Syria. But the Mormon state would be it would come together because basically a fringe faction of the priesthood would take power over the Mormon church, and they would become militant because they would see it as apocalyptic, and they would feel the need to seize control from Nelson, who is the current church president, and they would call themselves the Supreme Council of Elders, and they would take control over the Mormon church and become more militant, and you would see them sort of paralleling what the Islamic State did, and you would see them basically starting to lay roadside munitions and beheadings, and they would do things like that, and they would make a call for Mormons around the world. And yes, there are Mormons in other nations. They would make a call to Mormons around the world to come to the Mormon state and join their forces, their militant forces. And the Mormon state would spread into New Mexico, small parts of Arizona, Colorado, and small parts of Wyoming. And ham radio operators would play a huge role in the internal civil-style conflict. They would disseminate propaganda of the various groups to get the movements to start to spread. Now, you really saw this take float with the one group called the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, which is also another radical group that started out with noble intentions to rebuild America in a more right-wing sort of ideology, but they ended up becoming, they had a spat within their ruling council, which became even more split and divided. And then there was a conflict within the ruling council to where the most radical leader, a former ex-army colonel, seized power, and his deputy was part of the intelligentsia of the former conservative movement, who happened to be a mathematics professor that he put in control over the logistical aspects and other aspects of the movement. Now, this is a call to basically a parallel to the Khmer Rouge. Now, when the Khmer Rouge took power in Cambodia, they had a math professor named Doik, and Doik took control over the prison system, like S21 prison and others, where horrible atrocities came to be. Now, the math professor, part of the conservative intelligentsia, came out of the University of Iowa in this scenario, and the movement began in Nebraska and Iowa and spread nationwide as right-wing militias began to rise up, and they became more radical in their approach, and their approach started from being noble to turning more radical, and they felt the need to cleanse America, cleanse it. They wanted to cleanse it of former regime elements, and they wanted to cleanse it of the other factions and put America under a radical, secular, humanist, ultranationalist agenda. Now, what I mean by cleansing is they had roving death squads in this scenario that turned into hardcore paramilitary elements that were ultranationalists, and they would go around and start to massacre areas and conduct reprisal cleansings where they would have mass hangings and also mass graves where they would line people up and execute them by firing squad, especially those globalist regime elements, and as well as their other enemies like the Free American Army, and also they wanted to expand into the Southeast and start seizing territory there. So they ended up not only fighting the former regime, but they also ended up fighting the Army of the Southeast, which wanted to make Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina liberated and joined up with the now free Florida National Army, which was the Republic of Florida's armed forces. So basically, it was a multi-way civil conflict. Oh, and I didn't want to leave out the other factions. There's also the Union of Southwestern Militias, who want to liberate Arizona and Nevada of all other elements. Like, they wanted to liberate it from the Free American Army forces that were in both areas, in southern Nevada and also in central Arizona, which came about due to the former regime forces of Fort Huachuca ending up to joining the Free American Army forces. And they wanted to also liberate the Hoover Dam area of regime forces, of the globalist regime. Now, they also had an issue with the Mormon state because the Mormon state wanted to expand into Nevada and also Arizona, as well as the Mormon state having it out with the La Raza narco state. And also, there was an uneasy truce between the ultra-nationalists of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front and the Mormon state, who had at the beginning had some very, very ugly battles. The Mormon state was known to employ suicide trucks packed with homemade, we'll just say homemade materials. And also, the Mormon state was known for its beheadings and forcing women into polygamist relationships, we'll just say. Basically, a specific form of sexual slavery. Just sort of similar to the Islamic State in Syria. The Mormon state had no tolerance for any sort of certain lifestyles, I'll just put it, and they ended up beheading many of them for that. The Mormon state and the La Raza narco state and the National Salvation Revolutionary Front were probably the three most, well, and the regime too. Well, I can't leave the regime out. The regime's pretty evil, the globalist regime. Those four factions are probably the worst factions on the whole map in terms of their level of brutality. Now, the Mormon state ended up, in this scenario, they ended up going to expanding into Pueblo, Colorado, where chemical munitions have been stored, like VX and sarin, and also the National Salvation Revolutionary Front also got a hold of chemical weapons when they expanded into Bluegrass, Kentucky, and seized that depot there. And the regime, of course, had their own chemical weapons, which they used indiscriminately against populations in Fort Detrick and other areas, like, at Anniston, Maryland, and such. These three factions had access to WMDs essentially, so they used chemical weapons in the form of artillery shells. A lot of ex-military veterans of the former wars joined all the various factions. So you had these types of people training up new people. Yes, child soldiers were used too because of the manpower requirements. The biggest forces on the map were the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, as they controlled the most territory by far. But there's also neutral areas, and there's even smaller factions too. The Army of the Southeast is a small faction. The Maine Militia Army in Maine was trying to keep regime forces out of seizing control of Maine, in southern Maine there. And the Union of Southwestern Militias is a relatively small force because of the area that they hold doesn't have a very large population to draw forces from. And also, another small one is the Northwestern Conservative Army, which simply wants to expel regime elements from the rest of Washington and the rest of Oregon and make those an independent republic. They are allied with the Union of Southwestern Militias, who try to coordinate their offensives together. Now, in this civil conflict scenario, you would see various aspects of both high-intensity conflict and low-intensity conflict. What I mean by high-intensity conflict is that you would see certain battles taking place that were intense, that were large, that involved large unit fighting, and also small use of air power when it was available. Now, you have to understand that in such a conflict, when there is a fuel shortage, a food shortage, that resources would be the key thing that all factions are really fighting over. But they also have their own agendas and their own goals. So basically, Texas was also a big faction, of course. But Texas, their military forces consisted of the Texas Air Guard for their Air Force that became their National Air Force, same in Florida. And also the Texas National Guard became the Texas Army, as well as a huge force of various Texas militias that cropped up in all the towns and cities across Texas, who answered the call to become basically cannon fodder for the new Texas nation. But they did there was a huge battle in Texas around Fort Hood, and it was the siege of central Texas, where you saw that little blotch of regime elements. Well, Fort Hood was loyal to the regime, but the forces of Texas, big though they were, surrounded that area, and a huge battle ensued there. Now, keep in mind, the regime being low on fuel after sabotaging itself and its fuel capacity by trying to go over to green energy, they sort of shot themselves in the foot. And this affected the military forces because the fuel refining capacity of America had drastically shrunk due to their piss-poor policies and their globalist agenda, which ended up hindering their own war effort in the internal Syrian-style conflict. Now, also, the regime had forces spread around the world, and they had no ability to bring them back because airlifting them was impractical and impossible due to their lack of logistical abilities. And over time, although the regime began holding essentially the whole nation, once the riots started, things fell apart really fast. So things collapsed to a point to where the regime was basically was basically shrinking, and it lost a lot of control over a lot of the nation. Now again, ham radio operators contributed by disseminating propaganda to various parts of the country, and that's how these elements, these factions grew. And the Free American Army also held a fairly decent size of turf because they split from the regime. Because the generals originally, during the riots and the false flags, the generals initially tried to launch a coup to put America back under the Constitution, but the coup failed, and like the Free Syrian Army in Syria, you ended up with the Free American Army. Although they held oil resources in Louisiana and refineries, which was their saving grace, the capacity for fuel production was very, very low and hampered. Texas had the best fuel capacity of all, even though theirs was minuscule due to the self-sabotage before the internal Syrian-style conflict began. But they did keep Florida, their ally, afloat by sending tankers full of fuel to Florida, just enough to keep them going during this internal conflict. Now, the main militias and the Union of Southwestern Militias, the Southeastern, the Army of the Southeast that wanted to join up with Florida, they were aligned with Florida and Texas, but they had a lot of issues because they had a lot of enemies. They had to fight the regime in Savannah and Macon. Macon was a huge battle between the Army of the Southeast and the Free American Army and the regime, who all were fighting over Macon, Georgia, which is right where their lines intersected, about the middle of the state. And also, you know, you had basically the Mormon state, although they were at a truce with the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, both sides did have hefty, humongous battles at the beginning, to where each side lost lots of troops. But the radical, they both matched each other in terms of how radical they were. One was a radical theocratic state, and the other was a radical, ended up being a secular, humanist, ultra-right nationalist state, and both employed ugly methods against each other, which forced them to have a truce so that they could focus on their other enemies. Now, Texas had an uneasy truce with the La Raza narco state. At first, they basically wanted to retake the city of El Paso, which was a very, very narrow corridor by which the La Raza forces crossed into the United States, into New Mexico. So they, due to pressure from Mexico, left Mexico and turned part of New Mexico into their state. But because the Mormon state hated them and hated their druggy ways. They were having a huge battle with the La Razas, and the La Razas had to make a truce with Texas, and Texas retook El Paso, but they allowed the La Razas to use El Paso to acquire weapons because for Texas, that kept the Mormon state off their back because they already had to fight regime forces in central Texas, and they had to fight also with the Free American Army that tried to bring Texas back into the fold, and because they wanted all of America under constitutional rule again. So you just had this giant multi-way civil conflict where all these sides raided armories, raided the troops left the regime, and you had National Guardsmen deserting due to the poor conditions in the regime and joining either the Free American Army or joining, in the case of Texas and Florida, becoming their national armies. Some had sympathies for the Mormon state, and others had sympathies for the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, and others that were from the Northwest joined up with the Northwestern Conservative Army, and you had the Union of Southwestern Militias. Some of them obtained weapons from armories, and so on and so forth. And you had lots of human rights violations, and you had the use of sarin and VX nerve agents in the form of artillery shells. When aircraft did fly on rare occasions, due to the poor logistics and lack of fuel, when aircraft did manage to fly, they basically indiscriminately attacked various civilian areas, and many people suffered, many people died. And all of that was a result of the collapse. So you had neutral and non-aligned areas that were simply whole swathes of territory where the communities wanted to stay out of it. They were essentially in a defensive posture against all factions. They didn't want them expanding, and they didn't want to join any of them. And like I said, about the biggest faction that controlled the most territory, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, they got their territory based on the dissemination of their propaganda, and they were the most effective propagandists. And they managed to spread their ideology, which created the huge territory they ended up ruling over. And, there were all sorts of other means employed, and it resembled very much the type of conflict that we saw in Syria, where it was, medium to high intensity at times, but at other times it was low intensity, where you would see the use of roadside munitions to hit convoys and such other type things. You would see atrocities committed against civilians by all sides, minus maybe Texas and Florida, who just wanted to be independent and stay out of it all. But most sides committed atrocities in this internal conflict scenario, so very few didn't. So that's essentially the rundown of it. I hope people found that interesting, because when I actually do the live and I read the scenario script behind it, I'm going to go into such a depth with this stuff, such detail with this stuff. It's gonna make people's heads spin. Like, I'm gonna explain all the leadership of each faction, how they came to be, how each faction grew and became what they became, and how they ended up fighting each other and having truces with each other or forming alliances with each other in some cases, and that was very few cases. But most of the time it was a multi-factional internal civil conflict, and brutal atrocities were committed by all sides in that, mostly, minus a few who ended up following Geneva Conventions like Texas and Florida. Although the regime claimed they followed Geneva Conventions, they really didn't. They brutalized their prisoners. Also, the Mormon state as well. The Mormon state might as well have never heard of Geneva Conventions, because they beheaded all their prisoners. But yeah, that's essentially the rundown on the internal Syrian-style conflict, you guys. I hope you find that interesting. And my other project coming up is going to be on the invasion. Now, remember, I'm going to do this based on the best-case scenario, like taking the pace of life as it is now and throwing a Chinese and Russian and allied invasion into that. So it's going to be a scenario where we haven't had an internal conflict or anything like that, but the economic conditions are bad, but they're not like total collapse mode, but we get invaded, which is a best case scenario. And even in that scenario, we lose badly. We lose badly. It's horrible. We're overtaken in like 4 days. And I told you in the previous lives why that is the case. Now, if you look at my thumbnail for this, if you're wondering what that is the Chi-Com copy, essentially, of the F-22. People try to compare it more to the 35, but they're incorrect because it's more streamlined than the 35, which looks clunky and boxy and has a horrible canopy. The canopy of the J-31, as pictured, is more streamlined and looks a lot more like the F-22, as do the dorsal wings and the rest. It's more akin to a slightly miniaturized F-22 with upgraded radar, electronic warfare capabilities, and also advanced targeting systems and radars and such. And avionics. They took the F-22 and made it better and smaller. So that is what you're seeing on the front. Now, keep in mind, the Chinese already built their own indigenous stealth fighter jet called the Ch1na, and they have lots of J-20s by now. They've mass-produced those J-20s to the point to where they have hundreds of them, hundreds plural. So basically, I just wanted to say that I'm going to talk more about my predictions now. I'm going into that because I've had a lot of people saying to me in comments threads, and my comments somehow mysteriously disappear when it's on another channel because they don't want people coming and finding my work. I literally cut and paste the same comment to respond to somebody last night. If that person's in here, then they know what I'm talking about. I told them I was going to do a live tonight, so if they're here, give me a shout out. I'm going to look at the chat real quick. Michael, if you're here, say something. Say something. I tried to cut and paste the answer to your question, and it kept deleting it. So I told you just to come over here. If you're here, say something. But anyways, yeah, I basically want to talk about my predictions, and this is what I saw, what I mentioned before. Now remember, these are my personal predictions. These are not set in stone. This is just what I see based on data, based on mathematics. This is what I see, okay? The data is not incorrect, but my predictions could possibly be off, but I see them coming to pass, so I don't think that's the case. I see by summer, we are going to get so low on food, it's going to be bone dry in stores. The fuel situation is going to hit a crisis point along with the food. Food's not going to be produced as easily due to the lack of fuel to run the farm machinery. So what you're going to have is by the end of summer, you're really going to notice that the food is becoming bone dry. And in some areas, it might hit a crisis level altogether. And I mean like a crisis point to where you have these sorts of riots occurring over food riots, and fuel riots perhaps too. Now, at the same time, I told you all that I predicted that by July, the entire Eastern European Ukraine fiasco would be over. And I'm seeing signs that that's going to come to pass exactly as I said it would on time by July, because they're showing a lot of cracks and discipline is breaking down in the Ukrainian armed forces. They're down to their last old men in their territorial defense units on the front lines. They're already showing signs of logistical collapse, And no matter what weapons and logistics the West tries to send to keep them going, it seems to be intercepted, destroyed, or it ends up in mostly the wrong hands because it gets sold on the black market, as I've said many times in the past. So, you know, you're seeing these interceptions. You're seeing the stuff not going to the right hands. You're seeing old men as their last line of defense. It's all going to collapse. And you're seeing a lot of turmoil with the regime there, who's led by an actor of all people. So really, he's a puppet taking orders from NATO, from D.C. So you're seeing all the signs of a Ukrainian collapse being imminent. So again, as Russia is becoming victorious with the very minute, tiny little forces they sent in there that ground the entire Ukrainian military down, essentially. I mean, look at it. I mean, 70-something battalions, it's like 70 battalions or so, went in there. About 63 to 65,000 odd troops have utterly obliterated the entire 650,000 man Ukrainian armed forces and paramilitary. So, yeah, all the heavy weapons they began with, the Ukrainians, are gone. They're gone. So that's why the West has to send them stuff, because the Ukrainians lost all their heavy weaponry. I mean, I'd say about 95% of it's been obliterated. Whatever wasn't hidden away in some sort of a bunker system has been destroyed. So the West has to send howitzers, and they're trying to send rockets like the HIMARS system, but those things are being destroyed because they're big-ticket items, just like the Russians when they cruise missiled the warehouse that was storing the S-300 batteries sent by, I think, the Czech Republic or Slovakia. It was one of those two. They were destroyed. Well, why were they sending those? It's because the Ukrainians have no air defense capabilities left. They have none left. Russia is in control of the skies. Russia sent in very small forces. 70 battalions is not a lot, you guys. It's only like 63, 65,000. You know, I'm just stating facts. You know, I'm not pro-Russian or anything. I'm stating facts. You know, that in that conflict, you know, Russia committed very little, and they've destroyed a whole lot. And NATO is scared shitless of it, which is why they continue to try to beef up a Ukrainian force, but they're failing. Russia has shown that they can hit every corner of Ukraine. They've done it with Caliber cruise missiles. They've done it with different types of artillery systems, like in the east. They've done it with heavy strategic bombers. They've done it with tactical fighter bombers, and so on. So, you know, there's not one corner. Oh, and I forgot, tactical ballistic missile systems too, like the Iskander. There's not one corner of Ukraine that hasn't been hit in some form or fashion. So this rumor about some 1 million man army is an utter joke. Ukraine will collapse by July, and other theaters will open up. And if Taiwan occurs, like I've said before, China will overrun that place. I don't see them doing it like a limited incursion, like how the Russians did. And I told you the difference between a limited incursion and a full-scale invasion. The Russians did a limited incursion because they have a lot of territory they have to occupy with their 3.2 million man military and 300,000 man paramilitary. And Russia has a humongous amount of equipment. They have 12,500 active tanks. That is a huge tank force. It's second only to China. So China has almost 20,000. Well, actually, if you count their light tanks, like I said in my last live, China has 23,000 something tanks. I have it all wrote down, of course, but I'm not I'm not with those papers right now. I'm just stating what I remember from the top of my head. It was like 3,800 light tanks, and it was like 19,100, I think, of main battle tanks. So that's like 23,000 something tanks that China has, while Russia, they do have 8,000 tanks in storage, but most of those in storage are boneyard tanks. Like, they're out in Russian boneyards and haven't been maintained for many years due to budget constraints in the 90s and just, Russia producing new tanks anyway, so they're not spending money to keep those tanks in prime fighting shape. So what they're used for in Russia, in those boneyards, is they keep them for spare parts. Should they want to resurrect some of those tanks, they can take the good parts from other tanks, put them into those other tanks, and resurrect some of them if they wanted to. I'm sure a small number of them would work if they wanted them to, but most of the 8,000 tanks Russia has in storage aren't maintained like the Chinese storage tanks, which actually belong to different units. The ones in the Russian storage are in boneyards, and they're kept there for just spare part usage, if anything else. They can cannibalize the older vehicles to rebuild some of the older ones should they ever need it. But most of Russia's tanks are the T-72BM variety, which is the newest iteration of T-72. It's an upgraded, much better T-72 than the original T-72. The T-72BM, the T-80U, the T-90A, and the T-90M are the best Russian tanks, along with the Armata. The Armata is their newest tank, their newest, most advanced tank, and I would put the Armata up there with either the Chinese Type 96 or the 99A, which I explained the Chinese tanks in my last live. If you all want to learn all the technical specs of the Chinese tanks, I suggest you go to my last live when this live is over and watch that, because I go into the actual technical details of the Chi-Com tanks, and I tell you what their capabilities are, and what kind of systems they have integrated into them, and armor, engines, everything. I tell you all of that in the last live. So yes, the Russians have a huge tank force after China, and Russia hasn't lost much of it at all. The Ukrainians are so desperate. I heard Gonzalo Lira saying that the Ukrainian propaganda is trying to use clips from a Russian tank museum where they let people ride old tanks. They tried to use a clip from the Russian tank museum and say that Russia's running low on battle tanks, which is utter bullshit and lies, because we know the Ukrainians have Western propagandists giving them tips on how to make propaganda. But back to my predictions. I predict the collapse of Ukraine by July, no later than July, and about that time is when you're going to start to see cracks in our system with our food and fuel. And they've self-sabotaged so much of their food system. I find it very hard to believe that we are going to be a stable first world nation by year's end. This place is going to utterly collapse into, first it'll be riots, then different factions and cliques, like I showed you in my community post, are going to click up. Those are just hypotheticals, but that can very easily happen. If people don't think stuff like that can happen, then they're blind, okay? They're blind. They're blind, and they refuse to see the truth. The truth is that if this place goes into an internal Syrian-style conflict, you will see factions and cliques clicking up together, and you will see technical specialists and ham radio operators and other types of people coming out of the shadows and playing a role in that. They will play a role. You'll see various factions aspire to various goals and objectives, and they're going to be fighting over resources. You will see neutral towns and communities that try to hold out against the different factions. You will see the regime lose its grip, because let me tell you something. When the regime's false flags and self-sabotage backfire on them, they're not going to have nowhere to go. In fact, they're going to be losing territory. And the United States regime has basically alienated itself from much of the world, even from allies. You're not going to see very much international help at all, if any. I mean, what you might see is you might see volunteers from other nations, like you saw in Syria, like you saw in Ukraine. You might see volunteers from other nations come to help different factions, like in my scenario, how I have the what's it called, Mormon state. You might see Mormons from around the world answer the call and come to help the Mormon state. Or you might see the regime use international brigades to sort of help its manpower crisis, its manpower shortage, after other elements of the regime break off and split up. It'll be an all-hands-on-deck situation, since I told you before, the regime only has, between all branches and components, 2.2 million troops, okay? That's reserves, that's National Guard, and that's active duty. Now, when a lot of reserve and guard units leave, that's going to leave them with even less. And all the troops that are overseas, they're not going to be able to bring them back to help. So there's going to be an acute manpower shortage. It will be acute. And you will basically, you're not going to see a huge regime force that can hold down humongous areas. There will be regime loyalist areas like California or like, Chicago or Detroit, places where the regime already has like a firm backing, but you're not going to see it nationwide. They just don't have the troops. They don't have the logistical ability to basically hold this entire place down. It's impossible. They don't have the personnel, and they're not going to have the resources in order to do that. You're going to see a lot of discipline breaking down because they allowed certain lifestyles into the military, and they made it woke. The woke military has a new generation of troops, as I've told you before. It's this Call of Duty generation and this woke generation that have never experienced real war, real combat. And when this place breaks down, discipline will break down, and you'll see the regime forces splitting up. You're going to see desertion. You're going to see it all. It's all going to happen. So have no illusions. This place will be a madhouse. It'll be a madhouse, and anything will go here. Anything will go here. By like the term, anything goes. It'll be a madhouse. It'll be like a slaughter fest between different factions and people. So it'll be ugly here, and there will be no law and order. The law and order will be might makes right. So he who has the arms will be he who makes the rules, just like in African civil wars, just like in Syria, and just like in Ukraine. He who has the weapons makes the rules. So it'll be a brutal civil conflict, and that'll happen as soon as more false flags happen. That'll happen as soon as more food and fuel crises happen. And you'll see the riots, which will morph into all-out, civil conflict. Like Dimitri Duduman's prophecy even said, it'll start by people in the center of the country fighting the regime, and then out of nowhere, China and Russia and their allies. He said he didn't remember some, Dimitri Duduman, and I'm quoting him. He said he didn't remember some. He just remembered China, Russia, and some allies popping up off the coasts and inside, and they're going to basically just take this place. They're going to take it, because by that time, this place is going to be so worn down from its logistical and supply chain crisis, and it's going to be so worn down from fighting itself. Because even Dimitri Duduman said the regime will be busy with internal problems. Well, I see that happening in real life with real data to back it up. So Dimitri Duduman wasn't so crazy, was he? See, my work is not based on prophecy. My work is based on physical facts. Though I do find prophecy interesting as a believer of Yeshua Messiah, I find it interesting, but my work, God told me to show the physical stuff that backs up the prophecy, because oftentimes people knock prophecy, and I don't like to see prophecies of God being knocked. So therefore, I am the man that acquires physical proof, physical facts that back up prophecy, that prove prophecy to be correct. So yes, I find prophecy intriguing, and I love to back it up with facts and figures and stats and capabilities, and I'm very much doing that. So my predictions were that this summer, everything's going to go to hell. This whole place is going to have internal crises like you could never believe, that are going to morph into internal conflict like Syria and like other places. And it's going to have characteristics of all the worst internal conflicts you've ever seen around the globe. And that'll weaken us to a point where we're so weak that when China and Russia come in, they're just going to mop up. It'll be a mop-up job. They virtually will lose nothing to come in here. This place will be so battered down after fighting itself, that China and Russia are going to come in and mop up with minimal losses. Minimal losses. So basically, you see China and Russia building themselves up while the West is tearing itself apart. As I've said in all my past live streams, you have two very different sets of elites. They're not all a unified front. And I'm tired of people thinking that the Western elites, these silver spoon in the ass, uber rich elites, control everything when they don't. Do you think Satan wants a bunch of snobby elites running the world? No. No, the beast is a man of fierce countenance, and he wants his 10 kings who will be victorious warlords over the West. The West is a sacrifice so that the Eastern-centric one-world system can arise. There will be no Great Reset. It'll be an Eastern-centric system that will arise with the 10 kings, and the 10 kings will be of Eastern origin. They will be Chinese, Russian, and their allies will be the other 8 kings, who will be victorious over the West and their rivals, the Western elites, who tore themselves down. Satan doesn't want these snobby, silver spoon in their ass World Economic Forum types as co-rulers with his son, the beast. No, he wants warlords like Xi Jinping, like Putin, and like their allies. It'll be an Eastern-centric system. The Great Reset will not happen. It will not happen. They're trying to implement it, but it's all going to fail. But it has to fail for the true one-world system to come in and take over. And that is impossible almost, note the word almost, that is impossible for the Western mind, for the mind of a Westerner to comprehend. For a Western truther, they're looking at all the wrong stuff. They're looking at this Great Reset stuff. It's all look at the right hand while you ignore the left hand. Well, the left hand is these Eastern elites, the 10 kings, who are going to smash Babylon, USA, just like in prophecy, just like in Jeremiah, just like Dmitri Duduman and Henry Groover and all the old prophets said. It's going to be the East. The East is going to destroy the West. The West isn't even mentioned in the end times in the Bible. It's not even a factor because Babylon is destroyed and Western Europe is going to be overrun by Russia and China. China is already putting massive forces in Serbia, and I've showed you guys this. I've even showed you guys how Xi Jinping goes everywhere the CHICOM troops go. The cargo planes from China have made tons of flights into Serbia to ferry in troops and materiel, their equipment, their everything, their logistics. They are preparing to help Russia to steamroll Western Europe, and it will be done. Just like how Russia and China are going to invade the United States, which is Babylon, and crush it. It doesn't matter how much money and wealth these uber-rich, snobby, pretty hands-having Western elites have, it's not going to save them. They are going to learn the meaning of a hard day's work in a Chinese-run concentration camp where they're going to break big rocks into small rocks, and if they don't meet their quota, then they're going to not get their bowl of rice, and they're going to get put into a stress position like I wrote out in my first story, how the CHICOMs made them sit on their knees in gravel and pea gravel until they couldn't stand it anymore and went insane from pain and misery. And they hooked their backs to the wall, chained up with a pipe run between their back and their elbows to hold them in place. So yeah, these Western elites are going to basically, the Western elites are going to be knocked down by China. They're not going to make it. They're not going to get out of this. They're delusional. They think they're going to ride off into the sunset with all the wealth they've stolen and fleeced the people of the West for, but they're not going to make it. They're going to pay for all that they've done. And if you survive to see the end of Babylon, then you're going to see evidence of that too. Because when the beast shows up on the scene, he is going to flatter the 10 victorious kings in World War III. And the beast is going to say, oh, we just suffered the worst war in human history. Oh, we don't want to have any more of these wars. You know, let's make a peace treaty. And he's going to save Israel from being invaded by the 10 kings by a peace treaty, a covenant, which he's going to break midway through his rule, like it says in the Bible. So, you know, it'll be an Eastern-centric type of one-world system. The West is not going to be a factor in any of this. There will be no Great Reset. I've said this in my last lives, and I've provided evidence of this. So, you know, if people want to accept it, they can. If their brain can't comprehend the truth, then hey, I don't know what else to tell you. I can't do nothing else for you. You know, all I do is I research facts, I provide evidence. And, you know, that's essentially what I do here. I am a researcher. I am an analyst who deep dives into facts and data and capabilities and numbers, raw numbers. And I research things via multiple sources, many multiple sources. And basically, I take all that data, I overlay it over other data to find matching data. And that's how I arrive at my conclusions. I look at many sources. Most people don't have the patience to even do what I do. But you know what? Somebody's got to do it, so I do it. You know, and I'm trying to explain to people that, yes, the West will be destroyed. Its elites are not going to get away with it. They're going to have everything that they've ever fleeced from everybody taken from them in a moment's notice, and they're going to end up a slave or eliminated, just like the rest of the Western people will be. They're not, in fact, they're probably going to get treated worse than the ordinary Westerner because of their status. And they stand, the CCP only cares about the CCP. The CCP only cares about its own power. It doesn't give a rat's ass about Western elites. It doesn't. It could care less about them. It could care less about their Great Reset. The CCP played the West to gain all their secrets, to gain their trade secrets, their industrial secrets, to build their own indigenous capability, to then overcome the West in a later war. They've subverted the West, they've infiltrated the West, and the CCP has done this because they don't want to be under any sort of a Western system. The CCP loathes and hates the West. I've even shown you their propaganda that depicts the West as bankers and basically snakes. The Chi-Coms do not like us. They don't like what we stand for, or they don't like what the elites stand for even more. They don't like this country or its elites. So they are going to destroy this place with Russia. They and Russia are going to lead a coalition of the willing to disarm America, like what Bush said about Iraq. You know, that puppet, the man that essentially started the conflict that I ended up going to, and I saw the truth of it. And it wasn't for what they said it was. It wasn't to defend this country. It was to line the pockets of these punk Western elites. So these Western elites are going to basically be squashed by the Eastern elites of the CCP and the Russian political oligarchy class and the other elites, such as the Shia elites of Iran, which is an ally of Russia and China, which Chi-Com troops and Russian troops are already in Iran right now, and also the North Koreans, which are another secular humanist regime, which are essentially an appendage of China. They're like a Chinese puppet state, and the others. So Pakistan and the others. So they're going to be there. I feel that those are going to be the victorious 10 kings, and some others of World War III. They are going to defeat and destroy the West. And my other prediction, back to predictions, is that I feel, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I feel strongly that this nation could quite possibly be invaded by year's end, by winter of 2022, 2023. I feel like that is when we will be invaded. In fact, I've had a dream about it where I went back in time. I time traveled. It was a weird dream, one of the weirdest I've ever had. I time traveled from 2023 back to the 80s, And I met my parents and I told them about, I came back from World War III and I could tell you everything that's going to happen from the 80s and on to 2023. And I did tell them. They thought I was weird at first because they didn't know who I was, and I explained to them everything, and I told them things that only they would know, so that they then realized that I was telling the truth, and I told them everything. So after I had that dream, I strongly had a feeling that this would be it. That this would be it. Winter of 2022, 2023. After the collapse, a short internal conflict, and then foreign invasion. I really, really hope I'm wrong. I very much hope I'm wrong. I hope that, we have even more time to prepare, but I just don't see it. Mathematically, it looks like we're headed for a disaster of epic proportions. And, the stats of the logistics available, like the food and the fuel, it isn't adding up to anything good. I'll just say that much. It's not adding up to anything good. It would literally take a miracle to let us limp into 2023 in the current state that we're in. It would take a miracle for us to limp into 2023. And when I say limp, I mean limp, because we're still going to be in horrible shape, and it's going to get worse. And last night, you know what? I saw our local affiliate here in Texas, in North Texas. They put out a baby formula clip, and I watched it. I don't know why. I just felt like watching it. And they said that the baby formula shortage is going to get even worse than it already is, and parents can't find it. They're having to fly in foreign formula, which I said in the last live is something nefarious. It's something wicked, evil, because these Ch1na products, they've killed our pets with their pet food. They're tainted, contaminated pet food. So this baby formula, imagine what that could be like. So this whole thing is nefarious. And the fact that we even have to do this shows that we're becoming a third world nation, because a third world nation can't feed its people, can't even feed your babies. Then what kind of country are you? That's pathetic. It's garbage. So while we are deteriorating, and I saw that clip, it made me think about just the whole food collapse issue. It's going to get worse. It ain't going to get better. Nothing is going to get better. They keep slaughtering all the animals. They keep burning the crops. They destroy warehouses. It's like shooting ourselves in the foot. It's like that they think that they're going to seamlessly change from the current system we have into some sort of a fourth industrial revolution, but in reality, it's going to go back to the Stone Age. It's going to be like the Flintstones. This place is going to rip itself apart over limited resources, and very small areas are going to escape it. Very small areas are going to escape the trouble coming. And I'm talking about areas that God has ordained to be safe zones in such a collapse and internal Syrian-style conflict. Like the neutral areas I put on my hypothetical map, or like largely in Texas, or other areas where there's not a ton of fighting going on within the borders of those areas. Those are God-ordained areas on my map, but God might have his own ideas in real life of what areas are ordained by him in the reality we live in. I just put a hypothetical idea of where those might be on a hypothetical scenario map. But yes, I will do a long live to explain the map. I will show battle maps, and I will show examples of the goings-on in such an internal style conflict. So yes. Oh, yes, baby. I saw your comment. Yes, self-defense. Self-defense is everything. Everything. A good Christian practices self-defense. Not naked aggression. Never naked aggression. But self-defense is everything. You all know that I am I take a hard line on self-defense as a Christian, because I am an ex-soldier, an ex-combat veteran, and I've obtained my experience and skills. And you have to use those things for good. Yes, you can. Yes, you can use carnal weapons. It's not just spiritual. You are equally yoked to the spiritual and the physical. Yes, because spiritual warfare manifests itself in the physical. So thus, if the bad guys are manifesting in the physical, so too should we. But in defense. Self-defense is an all-around comprehensive thing that combines spiritual warfare, such as praying and such, but it also is very physical. The Bible is full of examples of self-defense in the physical. It's full of them. I've put up many self-defense videos in the past. I urge you to go watch those if you want to know more about what I'm talking about. But you have King David defeating Goliath, defending his fellow Hebrews. He even picked up 5 extra stones for Goliath's brothers. You have Ch1na, who in a lentil field eliminated 600 Philistines that accosted him, that attacked him, with a simple farming tool in self-defense. You also, look, you either believe the whole Bible or you don't believe it at all. You cannot cherry pick verses to make excuses for why you don't want to defend yourself when the Bible is full of examples. God even had the Hebrews fight an entire war to capture Israel when they came out of the Sinai. It was a defensive war because that land at the time was filled with evil peoples that wanted to eliminate the Hebrew people. And God wanted them to cleanse that land of evil. And they did. It was a defensive war. Now, look, Yeshua Messiah himself even said to sell your cloak and buy a sword. And that 2 is enough. 2 is enough. Yes. That is enough. If you have 2 firearms, that's good for one person. I mean, you can have more, of course, but, 2 is enough. A primary and a sidearm. Yeshua knew what he was talking about, even in ancient times, and he's the Son of God. He's the Word of God made flesh, and he is my Messiah, and I believe him, and I believe all he said. 2 swords is enough. Sell your cloak and buy a sword. He wasn't talking about getting a sword for spreading hummus or butter or whatever. He was talking about getting a sword to defend yourself from evil forces that attack you. Now, never, ever get naked aggression confused with self-defense. They are night and day. Aggression is a sin because it's prompted by sin. Self-defense is you protecting yourself from evil. Self-defense is righteous. Naked aggression is evil. And basically, the verse that says, live by the sword, die by the sword, that's not talking about people defending themselves. That's talking about murderers and thieves and evildoers that literally live by their sword. They do wicked acts with their sword, with their weapon. And they will die by it because people defending themselves will eventually eliminate them. Somehow, some way, these Jesuit lying priests infiltrated the American church and tried to turn Americans into cuckolds and weaklings. So, they tried to spin things to make it easier to butcher Christians. That's all it is. But that's going to help make prophecy come true, and many Christians are going to be butchered because that they didn't stand up for themselves. Now, look, I understand. Everybody has a calling. Not everybody is able to defend themselves, and I get that. But if you're an able-bodied man, and you don't defend yourself, you have no excuse. Because in Revelation 21:8, cowards will be cast into the outer darkness. I don't ever want that to happen to me because you know what? I'm able-bodied enough that I'm going to protect myself and those around me. Because that's what a good Christian would do. A not-so-good Christian would be an able-bodied man who's more of like a beta, and he's going to sit back and let evildoers do evil. No, that's cowardice, and there's no excuse for that. A good man would intervene and stop the evil. That's the truth. That is the plain, unadulterated truth. God never changes. God was the same in ancient times when the Hebrews did acts of self-defense in the physical. God is the same in the New Testament when Yeshua said to sell your cloak and buy a sword. Now let me tell you something. The only reason he healed that guard's ear after it was chopped off because the disciples had swords. Yes, they carried swords for self-defense. If Yeshua was so against that, they wouldn't have swords. But they did. They carried swords for self-defense. Yeshua himself said to sell your cloak and buy a sword. The only reason Yeshua healed that ear is because he knew it was prophetically his time to be a sacrifice for all the sins of man. That's the only reason why. You know, if it wasn't the case, had it been any other time, I'm sure those disciples would have defended him and gave their own lives for him. And they would have. But Yeshua knew it was his time to go. Yeshua, he experienced even righteous anger when he flipped the tables in the temple and he beat the money changers with a whip for turning his father's house into a house of merchandise. That was a very wicked thing, and he had to make it right. So he went in there and he did what he had to do. You know, Yeshua is not coming back like Barney the dinosaur to give evil a hug. No, Yeshua Messiah is coming back to kick evil square in the ass, pick up the false prophet and the Antichrist and throw him into the lake of fire alive. And he is going to open up his mouth, and the sword that comes out of his mouth is going to kill all the evildoers, and the blood will be so high it'll run up to a horse's bridle. That's what it says. You know, read your whole Bible, take it in the proper context, and stop listening to Jesuit false teachers and liars that try to wimpify Christianity. I'm tired of that. This is not the time for that. You know, people have to harden themselves and get tough because we're about to go through some tough times. And if you're a man, you need to defend your woman, you need to defend your children, and you need to defend yourself and your friends, whoever's around you. You need to be a good Christian man, and you need to defend them, you know, with righteousness. You can't let evil happen to people that are in your care. You cannot let evil happen. A man who doesn't provide for his family is worse than an infidel. And guess what? Part of those provisions is self-defense. That's in the Bible. It's all throughout the Bible, self-defense is, but that verse I just read you is in the Old Testament. A man who doesn't provide for his family is worse than an infidel. I believe that's in, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's in actually Deuteronomy. I could be mistaken, but that verse sticks in my mind, and it's the truth, you know. So you either believe the whole Bible or you don't believe it at all. I just wish people would stop cherry-picking verses to fit their own narratives. You have to follow the whole Bible in its proper context, and you have to understand that God never changes. So if God was for something in the Old Testament, he's still for it in the New. And that even shows how the disciples carried swords. Now Yeshua said to sell your cloak and buy a sword. You don't think those disciples, when they went to spread the word, you don't think they had to fight bandits on those roads? You don't think that they had to fight wild animals on those roads? Oh, man. One of the disciples went all the way to India to spread the gospel. You don't think he had to defend himself on the way there? You know, they were all even killed. You know, I mean, look, this is the reality of it. You know, we are going into the end times, and people need to practice righteous self-defense, not aggression. Never, ever, ever be the aggressor. Be only a defender. Only. Never, ever initiate any sort of aggression. But stand your ground and defend yourself if attacked, if aggressed upon. So, look, I've said that before in my past videos. That ain't nothing new. None of what I said is anything new. It's just a reiteration of what I've already said. So, you know, I just wanted to emphasize that because of the times we're in. We are going into times where really brutal, ugly things are going to happen. Listen, I've been to Iraq, okay? I've been to a third world war-torn nation. I've lived in Iraqi villages that got turned into combat outposts. So I've lived in the same types of positions that they've lived in, the Iraqis out there in the hinterlands of Iraq, in the east. I've lived in those types of places. It's a harsh environment. It's like ancient times. It's hard to really explain to people, but that's coming here. That's coming here. Whole areas are going to lose like services and power and water. I mean, it's going to happen. You're going to see a lot of brownouts, blackouts. Who's going to maintain the power plants? Only certain areas will have power where they're diligent about protecting the power plants during an internal conflict and protecting the workers that maintain and run them. So, yes, this place is going to have whole patchy areas that are without power when the internal stuff happens. But when the Chi-Coms invade and the Russians and the other smaller allies, they're going to basically do a cyber that takes down everything else. Anything that's left, the cyber and anti-satellite weapons are going to happen. Okay, simultaneously, they're going to take down what remains of our grid and our satellites, so that we're all blind. So the regime is even blind. Everything's going to be blind because there's going to be no GPS, no military networks are going to even run, none of it. So what are they going to do that with? Well, the Russians have the S-500 system, which is an anti-satellite. It's also anti-aircraft. It can hit high-flying strategic bombers. It can hit stealth planes. It can hit satellites. It's a very, very high-flying anti-aircraft, anti-satellite, anti-stealth plane air defense system. Just like the Chinese have their own called the HQ. Oh, I'm sorry, not that. Hold on, let me get the Chinese thing out. I was about to say the Ch1b, but that as good as that is, that's not the actual air defense thing they have. They have something else. Hold on, let me dig this paper out here real quick. Oh, here it is. Okay, the Chinese have the FK-2000, which is a long-range. This has been tested, and it's a very effective weapon. It's called the FK-2000. It's a long-range anti-satellite, anti-ballistic missile, and anti-stealth aircraft air defense system. It's built from the HQ-9B, which is an upgraded version of it. It's even more advanced. It can go even higher. It can hit very, very specific targets. Also, the HQ-9B is also very capable. It has a good range. It's like the S-400, but the S-400 is a little bit better with its range because the S-400 gets an extra 100 miles on it. See, the Chi-Com system is only 300 miles range, but the S-400 is basically the same as far as most of its capabilities, but it has a little bit longer of a range. It can go 100 miles past what the HQ-9B can do. But the FK-2000, that's a very long-range system. It's made to hit satellites, ballistic missiles, and stealth aircraft, and more. So, yeah, that the Chinese and the Russians, between the S-400, S-500, and the Chinese HQ-9B and FK-2000, yeah, they have everything they need to down our satellites, to down our everything. So they're going to use that stuff on us, you guys. It's going to happen. This place is going to go dark, Stone Age. If it isn't already Stone Age from the internal conflict, it's going to go dark, and there's going to be a lot of chaos, and the Chi-Coms are going to roll in, and the Russians, they're going to come out of their CCP regime properties, which during the internal civil conflict, they're just going to stay inside those, and they're going to butcher anybody that ventures near them during that conflict. So believe that. That's going to happen. They're just going to sit there, let us fight, let us butcher each other, so that when it's time for them to come out of their CCP regime properties, they're just going to roll everything over. Now, you think about it. When you have all these different factions and all this chaos going on, how is anybody going to stop it when they figure out that there's Chi-Coms here? Nobody's going to be able to stop it. Even though that if people stumble onto their places, they're just going to get butchered by the Chi-Coms holding out on those CCP properties. The regime can't do anything about it, because the regime is going to be busy with its own internal issues. None of the factions will really be able to do anything about the CCP regime properties, because the moment they go near it, the Chi-Com troops are going to have a level of technology and abilities that are just going to smite everyone that comes near their properties. So yeah, they're just going to sit back, sit in their CCP regime properties, the Chi-Com Trojans. So are the Russian Trojans on CCP properties and in other places. So are their allied Trojans. They're just going to sit on those CCP properties, let the internal conflict go on, and then at a certain point, they're gonna bust out of there and start capturing stuff the moment they get their muster signal to prepare for the invasion. They're going to rush out. They're going to capture things. Everything like I've shown you in my 96-hour invasion playlist documentary series, and also in my Pacific Northwest shorter documentary invasion series. Everything I've shown you, the same patterns will still apply. Even though those were in a best case scenario, taking how we live now and throwing an invasion into it, even though that's a best case, that's literally the same pattern that'll happen when we have our internal Syrian-style conflict. Only then, it'll be even easier for them to take over because, look, if we've been butchering each other, what are we going to have left to really throw at them when they come in and attack? Nothing. We will have no logistical capabilities, nothing. It'll be worse than Enemy at the Gates when they could only give every other man a rifle. And I'm talking about the regime forces. They're gonna get really low on their stockpiles. All the stockpiles of the warring elements, they're gonna get low eventually on stuff. They're gonna have to be more sparing with how they use certain types of equipment that they have that they've taken from armories or wherever. We're really not gonna have much of a defensive capability. Even if that united all the warring factions, it would be too late because everybody would be so weak by then. Even in a best case scenario, we still lose. And a best case scenario is that we didn't even have a civil issue. We just got invaded like we are now. Even in a best case, we lose royally. We lose horribly, royally bad. So in a civil conflict scenario, it'll be even worse. It'll be a mop-up job for the Chinese and for their Russian allies and even their smaller allies. It'll be a mop-up job. Now remember, China is a ginormous, gargantuan, gigantic military beast when it comes to conventional terms, and also the level of technology they have with all their newer stuff that they've been creating and mass producing, everything from the tanks that I showed you in the last stream, and how they even upgrade their older stuff and make it even better. So they have so much stuff to throw at us, the Chinese and then the Russians second. They have so much stuff to throw at us. The Chinese have the manpower to occupy this entire nation by themselves. And I've showed you that. And I've showed you all the stats and numbers of everything they have in my last live streams and even in older videos. China is a military behemoth in conventional terms. They're huge. They have the biggest combat air fleet. Not the biggest air force, they have the biggest combat air fleet, meaning they have the most combat planes of any nation on Earth. And they almost have the biggest air force. We only have a slight bit more planes than they do, but it's only because our air mobility command is so vast, it's so big. Like, we have a lot of transport aircraft, and that's the only reason why our air force is a little bit bigger than China's, is because of our air mobility command being so large. We have a lot of tankers, AWACS planes, and other types of aircraft too. But our combat aircraft, yeah, we have 1,000 less planes than China has in combat planes. So China has the biggest combat air force. They have the second most strategic bombers out of their biggest combat air force. Russia has a humongous Russia has a humongous strategic bomber fleet. They literally, with the bombers they maintain in storage, they have, with their active numbers and their naval strategic bombers, they have 571 strategic bombers. China has 242, which is second biggest. We only have 156 or 157. It's either that. It's for sure. It's either 156 or 157. But that's a lot less than China. It's way less than Russia. And Russia, they don't have as many fighters and tactical fighter bombers as China, but they have, like, they're almost neck and neck with us as far as being second in that category. But China just outnumbers us by so many planes because the number of fighters and tactical fighter bombers they possess is so vast and big. Nobody even comes close. And their strategic bomber fleet is second biggest. So you combine all those classes of combat aircraft, and China just has the biggest air force, combat air fleet by far. And now they have the biggest, most advanced Navy, and I've showed you guys all the data on that in past streams, and they have the biggest active military, at 4 million of their active military, Air Force, Navy, Army, and strategic missile forces. They have the biggest ground-based strategic missile forces, like I've showed you in a prior video that I made just on that, and that's a little bit ways back. I think it's about a month back. And also the Russian one is too, right after the Chinese one. But the Chinese have the biggest land-based missile forces of their strategic rocket forces, which is a branch of their active military. So China has a 4 million man active military. As of 2022, 5 million reserves. Huge reserves. And also their paramilitary, their gigantic paramilitary, it's gargantuan. It's huge. It's 20 million. 20 million. And that's combining the PAP, the People's Armed Police, which is a brutal paramilitary unit that suppresses the Uyghurs to the Gurs and other minorities in China. They have some combat experience with the low-level coin operations they've been doing in the West, in Xinjiang. They also are comprised of not just the PAP, the paramilitary also is comprised of the humongous national militia, which is like their home defense paramilitary force. It's sort of like our National Guard, only it's not part of their army. It's just part of their parallel military forces or paramilitary. They also have the Marine Militia, which is also very big. They have the National Construction Corps, which is like the equivalent of our Army Corps of Engineers, only they're armed and militarily trained by the military, and it's part of their paramilitary. So they're like combat engineers, but of paramilitary. They also have the PLA Strategic Reserves, which are just made for home defense. But they're all in all, that's a gargantuan force. Nobody even comes close to China's nearly 30 million troops. So Russia is next after them at 3.5, and Russia is comprised of their 3.2 million active military and reserves. I'm combining their active and reserve forces in that number. And then they have 300,000 internal troops, which are like their paramilitary National Guard, sort of like China's, but very, very much smaller. But Russia's 3.5 million is still bigger than our whole military. Our whole military is only 2.2 million, so Russia is quite a bit bigger. Anyways, all in all, they're going to invade and steamroll this place and crush it and crush it. And China and Russia both have hypersonic weapons. Actually, both developed them at about the same time. They developed their own. And even India has hypersonics with the BrahMos system. Yeah, China has the DFZF and some other types. And Russia has, the Kinzhal and the Zircon and others. But yeah, they have quite a number of them that are already deployed, and we're only in the testing phase and the R&D phase. We haven't even gotten one that we've started mass producing yet. Not in mass production. And if any of the tests were successful, they haven't been able to mass produce them because I'm sure they can't get the parts. They're not going to be able to build many, if any, at all. So we're way behind, you guys, in everything. In electronic warfare tech, too. China and Russia dwarf us in electronic warfare. They can jam any frequency we have. China hacked solar winds. So even it was admitted that China can shut down our whole nuclear arsenal by interfering in the communications and military networks related to it. It's been admitted that it's been compromised. Our nuclear deterrent has been compromised when that solar winds thing happened. China got so many files and so much information from that they know our entire system in and out. So if you think they didn't share that with Russia and their other allies, you're crazy. You're crazy. China can shut us down with also the chips that we bought from them and put in a lot of our equipment. China can shut down a lot of our planes, like the F-22s, that have Chinese chips in them, and more. And the F-35 is just garbage. It was made to be a be-all, sort of an end-all plane, but it can't. It's like the jack of all trades, but does none of them well, as others have said. I agree. I call it the flying soda can. It's not as nimble as our enemies' aircrafts are. It's actually a horrible aircraft. We never should have stopped producing the F-22, but instead of getting Chinese chips, we should have got Taiwanese chips. But the Chinese chips were cheaper, and the way the government works is they always go to the lowest bidder. So they bought Chinese chips from an enemy nation. Go figure. Go figure. So we never should have stopped producing the F-22, which is a vastly better aircraft than the F-35, but we stopped mass producing that. China already got all the information. They reverse engineered it, built their own version called the J-31, and miniaturized it so it'd be more nimble and aerodynamic. So yeah, they also built their own indigenous one, which was mass produced to large numbers, called the Ch1na, which was their first stealth aircraft. But now they have a copy of ours, of our F-22, which is our best aircraft. But they've reverse engineered it, took it apart, put it together their own, and made it better, upgraded it. So yeah, we're in big shit, deep shit. So I just wanted to share all that information with you guys tonight. And again, I'm going to be doing my audiobook on the invasion, but again, it'll be along with all the other stories I wrote in my community tab. If you scroll back, if you have a computer or PC, it's easy to scroll back and read those community tab stories. But if you have a phone, I know it's kind of a pain because you have to do a lot of scrolling and it's harder with a phone, but you could still be done if you're determined to read those. I did a parallel video series that goes with the stories in the community tab called Community Tab Review. That playlist shows you all the important stuff in the stories that you should have paid attention to that would help you as far as preparedness for wars and such. It shows you tactics, logistics, and the role they play in operations. It shows you all the stuff you need to know. It shows you sanitation, field sanitation, and why that's important, and how many deaths can occur from cholera, dysentery, and typhus because people don't know what to do with their garbage or with their human waste. And I show you how to dispose of it in that video. It is a life-saving video. I also talked about the tactics, again, very important, very important. I did it like building blocks, the entire review thing. I started with the small, basic stuff and built up as I went. So there's a lot of important videos in that review that go with the stories I typed out in the community tab. Now, when I do my audiobook, it's going to go along with the same invasion series as my 96-hour invasion, my which is the documentary playlist that shows the battle maps, a macro level view, a large level view of what's going on with units and such. It gets better as you go because eventually I got more into color coding and I made better maps. Because when I originally did the conceptual stuff, it was sort of basic with the Maryland, the upper Maryland map, the upper Chesapeake map, and the also the Missouri map. Those are basic, but I got better as it went. So if you want to watch that, it's a long series. It's over an hour. I mean, but it's worth it. It's worth every minute. It'll teach you a lot about how armies work and move. And if you read the descriptions, and I type out good descriptions, it'll help you understand what's going on the ground in those videos. So also, I thought I'd add that the Pacific Northwest documentary is less about objectives and capturing cities and roads and infrastructure, as it focuses more on the terrain and how terrain affects movements, because I picked the Rocky Mountain areas to show a mountain battle and how that works and how armies function in, rocky rubble, rocky mountainous terrain and difficult terrain with thick forests and such. I use that as a way to show how armies move in such a condition. Anyways, and what types of units are best for that type of fighting. But anyways, yes, my stories are more of a character street level first person view to show you what conditions on the ground would be like from a personal perspective. And I put a lot of detail into those community tab stories. And I'm going to put the same level of detail in my audiobook. All the docuseries, the community tab stories, and the community review playlist that goes with the stories, it's all the same invasion scenario. It's literally all the same, like the same dates, just different places, different people, different situations, but it all goes together, as will my audiobook. So I said all that to say that about the audiobook. So yeah, the internal Second American Syrian style conflict is going to be a good series, and I'm going to show you what all the details of that would be like and why and how and how things come to be and why and how things move and how it would look and just all the minute, small details with logistics and how they impact operations of various factions, how a lack of logistics would cause certain vehicle types not to be used at all, if or very rarely, because of the fuel consumption. And fuel is a big deal in the Second American civil Syrian-style conflict. So, and the lack of food too, breakdown in discipline in the regime forces due to their combat ineffective new generation of wokesters and I'll just say alternative lifestyles, as well as the Call of Duty kids that don't know what the hell they're doing and haven't really trained up all that well. So they're kind of combat ineffective. So discipline in the regime breaks down, and it sort of just kind of collapses from there, and that's how the factions come to be. So anyway, I'm going to show you all the details of all that and why and how, and it's as real as it's going to get. I'm going to make it so real that the details are going to be so realistic that you're going to I'm talking about how things work and how they come to be. You're going to have a complete understanding of how armies work, how things move, what it will look like, what types of things are in play, involved, what types of things get used, what doesn't get used, and why, what abilities they have, what lack of abilities they have, and why, and so on and so forth. That's all going to be shown in that series. But anyway, the internal Syrian-style conflict and the audiobook on the invasion, which will show the best-case scenario because it's going to go along with my previous invasion stuff, those are my two upcoming projects. And I will be doing a Technical Tuesday on Tuesday, and this time I'm going to do Russian tanks since I did Chinese tanks last time. I love you all. May Yeshua bless you all and keep you. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you got something out of it. Please go to the community tab and look at my map and read the whole post and read the pinned comment, and you'll learn a lot about what I'm trying to convey with the Syrian style thing. I love you all. May Yeshua bless and keep you all always. Thank you for coming.